Uh, So what I'm doing this morning is kind of a riff on the annual report that I shared 2 weeks ago. Talk about some things that we as a church and as Christians in America in 2023 need to keep, I believe, in front of our minds and hearts, sort of front-loaded moving forward. And one of the things that I shared was that we need to fight for our children. And when I say our children, I mean not only our personal kids, but also the children in the generation that have been entrusted to us as adults. The children who are currently being influenced by, teachers and school board members, politicians who are setting, establishing laws, artists who are producing music and movies and so forth, and all of these people as adults who are our generation, maybe a little younger, are having an effect on the next generation of young people growing up. And perhaps you all can already tell from my tone that I think that there's a lot of work needs done in that respect. Where do you even begin? Well, I want to begin by going back 4,000 years. I think you'll agree that's far enough back. We should be able to get our fingers under the edge of what I'm going to say here. You go 4,000 years back, and you do that in your Bibles, and you go back that far, and you'll find a story about Abraham, kind of the guy who kicked off what we call the salvation story. And that was because God had chosen Abraham to carry a very particular blessing, not only through himself, but through his offspring. The problem was that he, his wife Sarah, didn't have any offspring, did they? So Sarah made a decision that was actually part of their cultural legal system at the time. If you could not have children, but you wanted children, you had a servant, you could offer your servant to your husband as a sort of surrogate mom, and then adopt that child when the child was born, and then that child would be inherit the family blessing, the family estate, the everything that goes along with it. And that was what Sarah was thinking. If you ever thought, that's just weird. 4,000 years ago in that part of the world, it wasn't weird. It was, sometimes it was considered necessity. Whether she should have done that or not, that's a different question. It may have seemed normal to her. The young woman who was her servant was named Hagar, and Hagar, of course, did conceive, and she became pregnant with a child who turned out to be Ishmael. And as soon as she actually started showing, we read in Scripture that provoked a lot of jealousy in Sarah, and Hagar felt like her life was getting intolerable, and she ran away. She probably felt like she was in an unfair situation. She was right. She probably felt like everything that was happening was not only not her fault, but she didn't deserve it. And again, I want to say that she may be right about that. She may be right about that too. But as alone as she felt, and as isolated as she felt, she wasn't actually alone. She ran off and she met God. Unexpectedly. And God told her that she was going to have her own share of the promise as well. And he told her it would be safe to return, she should go back, and he would take care of her. And because she realized that she had never once been beyond God's sovereign understanding and his presence, she called him El Roi, the God who sees. The God who sees. But then Ishmael was born. And then, miraculously, Isaac was born to Sarah. And that caused even more conflict and even more drama. And once again, Hagar found herself outside, but not because she ran away. This time she was forced out. Exiled with her child into the wilderness. And it really was almost guaranteed to be a death sentence. In fact, the book of Genesis tells us that she got to a point where she was certain that her son was going to die, and she couldn't bear to watch it. She put him in the shade of a desert bush, and she walked away because she just couldn't bring herself to watch his suffering and to see him die. She knew it was coming. She knew it was inevitable, and it broke her heart. Now, I can't blame her for feeling that way. Very cruel thing to send a child and his mother out into the wilderness where water is almost impossible to find. It's almost inevitable that a child in that situation is going to die. It's certainly inevitable that they would suffer. Ishmael, though, was not seen the way we see children today, or the way I hope we see children today. He was seen also as a sort of a threat to the family fortune, a pawn in a power struggle, an inconvenience to be eliminated. So, yeah, it was cruel to send Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert, most likely to perish. But in the ancient world, human life was considered pretty cheap, especially lives of children. In fact, it was that way most of human history in most places. For example, in 1902, Stuart McAllister, a British archaeologist, started to excavate what turned out to be standing stones in a place called Gezer. This is west of Jerusalem, and discovered that what he was actually excavating was what the Old Testament called a high place, a place where Canaanite people would gather to worship. And he excavated these standing stones, a whole row of them. He also excavated an altar with a basin carved into the top there. And he also excavated a cave. In the cave, he found another sacrificial stone underground. So, serious stuff happening. He also found some other things. He also found, for example, a pit. There's a pit with hundreds of human remains just all jumbled together. Because the sacrifices that were taking place in this high place here weren't sheep or goats. He found some pretty specific remains. I'm going to spare you the photographs, but he found some pretty specific remains of children. In fact, one of the things that he found, and I've got it circled with these red circles, is he found a whole series of clay jars. And on the inside of the clay jars were the remains of infants who had been put through fire and burned as part of some sort of ritual and buried all around that site. All around that site. In fact, when he excavated that underground altar in the cave, there was still a human sacrifice, a child sacrifice, right there on top of the stone. Just the way it had been left 3,500 years ago. And you look at this sort of thing and think to yourself, what in the world could possibly, explain that kind of inhuman behavior? What was going on? I thank God that that kind of thing is unthinkable to us here today. But for most of the people in the ancient world, there would have been at least a sort of implicit understanding. For example, to consider a different culture with more ties to us, in ancient Rome, it was really, really rough being a child in ancient Rome. I mean, when you managed to grow up at all, there was a really good chance that you were going to be scarred for life. Spiritually, emotionally, and even physically. Aristotle, for example, defined a human being as a reasoning animal. So you can use your reason. An alligator can't do math. You can do math, so you're human. Alligator's not human. But you know who else cannot use reason is a 6-month-old child or a year-old child. And so in his thinking, an infant isn't even fully human because they can't reason, they can't think. What kind of behavior would result if a whole culture accepts that attitude towards children? You know, preparing this sermon was one of the least fun sermon prep experiences I've had in 20 years of ministry. But I'm going to charge ahead here because I think it's important that we understand Jesus' words when we get to them. It's like coming to an oasis in the desert. It's important for us to understand Jesus' words in the context of how people thought when he spoke to them about children. In ancient Rome, abortion was pretty common. It was pretty common. We know from the records that they wrote down and left for us that it was sometimes done to conceal infidelity and to protect people's ability to make their own free sexual choices. We also know that sometimes abortion was performed in case of economic hardship. Can't afford to feed another mouth, so that's going to happen. Sometimes among upper classes, abortion was even performed in order for women to preserve their figure, the way that they looked. They reported that for us as a motive, and that is something that has come down to us as well. Even more common than abortion, though, was a practice called exposure. Maybe you've heard of this practice. If you haven't, I apologize in advance. There's no easy way to say this, but the practice of exposure was basically just abandoning the child out of doors on a hillside or on a garbage heap or on the side of a road. So because of the high infant mortality rate, a child was not considered to have actually been born until 8 days after they were actually born. Actually, if you're a boy, 8 days after you're born, you're considered alive, you're given a name. 9 days, if you're a girl, you're considered to have been born if you survive 9 days. But not only do you have to survive those 8 or 9 days, you also have to not be abandoned, and that first week and a half of life is how long usually the father of the family had to decide whether or not that child was going to be exposed or kept. And sometimes children were exposed for reasons of economic hardship. Again, sometimes illegitimacy. Sometimes, in fact, usually if a physical deformity was detected in a child, exposure was the result. And we also know, because they recorded it, that it was sometimes done to select the gender that you wish the child to turn out to be. And of course, many of those infants died. Sometimes, though, they were picked up, and if they were picked up, it was usually for one reason, because that was something that people could do to generate some income. You could sell a child as a slave. And sometimes those children were sold into sexual slavery, and I'm going to not go into any more detail about that. I will just tell you that things that some people in our culture today are trying to normalize were already normalized long, long ago, all throughout the Greco-Roman world. Widely practiced, generally approved, not seen as a problem. And I read about this sort of thing in history books, and thank God that so far it is relegated to history books. And I think, how is it possible for human beings to behave like that? How is it possible for human hearts to accept that sort of thing? But you know what? Using children for economic gain, it's not that old of a thing. You may remember that even in the century that I was born in the early 1900s, children were used for exceptionally cheap labor in order to keep the Industrial Revolution cranking along. This is a photograph of boys. Should be in school, should be, I don't know, fishing in the creek or something, but instead they were sent to work at a canning factory. This is 1911. None of those kids look particularly happy. Most of the time you look at old photographs, they all look really serious anyways. But, yeah. Most people in most societies for most of history have had a fairly callous view of children in general. Now, it wasn't always the case that a mom and a dad were heartless towards their own kids. In fact, you could find plenty of examples where people had regard, special regard for at least some of their own offspring. I'm not going to deny that. But you could also find lots and lots of examples of parents, fathers, mothers, who were not attached to their own children in a way that we would find shocking if we could discuss it with them today. In ancient Rome, if you were a man and you cried over the death of your child, you would be officially criticized and mocked by the other men in your circle, because it was considered an unusual and an undignified way to be. So, if you look at the big picture, children were often viewed as a resource or a burden, sometimes not even fully human, and too often they were viewed as food gods. Now, I've said most, but not all, because of course there were exceptions, and you can find some exceptions that prove the rule. But one of my favorite exceptions is actually the very first philosopher who ever publicly denounced the practice of exposure. It was a Jewish philosopher named Philo. Lived in Egypt at the time, about 2 centuries before Jesus Christ. And I think to myself, where in the world would a Jewish person get the idea that killing infants is wrong? Well, he got it from the same place you and I could get it. This is a reference to the very kind of high place that I explained to you at the beginning of the message here. Because the children of Israel going into a culture that regularly burned their sons and daughters in the fire, sacrificed to their gods, and we still have evidence for it to this day. And they were told, don't you do that. Don't you do that. In the Old Testament, you see a lot of examples of children in general being extolled as a blessing from God, completely to the contrary of the way that most people would have believed, and certainly most cultures around Israel believed for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the idea that children are a blessing, it was there. It wasn't as popular as I would say it is now. Because you get glimpses of it, you may even get some strong hints. But when Jesus Christ addressed the topic, it was an epiphany. I mean, literally. And he went further than anyone else ever had gone in affirming the truth about children and how God feels about children. It's almost as if he took beliefs that were common and current in the world, beliefs about children, and flipped them over just like he did with the tables in the temple. And for much the same reason, children aren't just valuable, he said. They're an example to be followed. They're not just included in God's heart. They are exalted. And Aristotle would have choked to death on that idea. But let me show you what Jesus thinks about children. This comes from Matthew 18. The disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And you know what they were thinking. You know what they were asking a loaded question because they had to be assuming, well, it's got to be one of us, right? Jesus, 12 followers, the kingdom is pretty small right now. So, maybe it's me. I've got a 1 in 12 chance of getting that trophy, best disciple. Who is it, Jesus? If you had asked them 1,000 times before Jesus spoke, not once would they have guessed that he would do what he did. And calling to himself a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, Unless you turn and become like children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who lead me to sin, it would be better for him to have a millstone fastened around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. This is why I say that when you're studying this topic, for lack of a better word, when you come to the words of Jesus, you just want to stop. You just want to rest there. You just want to wrap yourselves in this beautiful expression of the innocence and the marvel of childlikeness that Jesus Christ gave to us out of his own heart. Nobody ever loved and valued children for their own sakes as much as Jesus Christ did. He never found them intrusive or annoying. He never found them a waste of time or bothersome. In fact, the title of this slide here, How Children Became People, that comes from the title of a book by O.M. Baki. I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is a book that he wrote about this very topic. How do people view children in the ancient world? How do they view children now? And how did we get from there to here? And of course, the difference is that Jesus Christ planted that idea in the minds and the hearts of people who knew him and believed him and followed him. And from there, it spread. It spread until it came to fill, well, much more of the world than ever before. You see, we think that high regard for children is normal because it's been around for a while. It's not normal. We had to be taught that. We had to be trained to think that way and to feel that way. Because this is true, it's true in romance, and it's true in family relationships, and it's true in friendship. God's love is not automatic. God has to teach us how to love each other. God has to teach us how to love. So now we stand 2,000 years after Jesus' teachings transformed the world. It's had time to sink in. We see things that we never would have seen any other culture or any other period. Let me give you some positive examples. For example, the legal system. We see a bunch of kids being forced to work in a factory. We pass a labor law because we think that's not right. We need to protect the children. We see someone, abusing children. We have laws in place to protect the children, whether or not they have parents, whether or not they have a family. And you never would have seen that in ancient Rome, or ancient Canaan, for that matter. In child psychology, ancient people just thought kids an empty cup. You pour in what you hope that they give you back out 20 years from now. And, that's it. And we now know that children are born with personality. And they're brimming with it. And that even the first 6 months of life are incredibly important to their development as a whole human being. We see it in the arts. You ever read a story or watched a movie that just celebrates the wonder and the innocence of childhood? And you enjoy a movie like that because that's how you want children to be seen, and probably how you see children yourself. You never would have seen stories told that way 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. We see institutions dedicated to the welfare of children. This one, for example, this is one single orphanage, 1,500 children, an orphanage run by George Mueller in Bristol, who was a German missionary to England and who realized there's a cholera epidemic, a lot of adults died, a lot of children were left completely orphaned. And he thought, you know what? I can start feeding kids. I can pray that God will give me the resources. More than 10,000 children went through his orphanages. Fed, protected, taught, and set on a course for a fulfilling life. all in the name of the love of God. You never would have seen that 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome. Not even close. You never would have seen something like the very first hospital for abandoned children established in Paris in 1638 by a guy named Vincent de Paul. Not just a guy who liked to use clothes. He was actively protecting and preserving the least of these in the name of Christ and in the love of Christ. None of these things would have happened apart from the teachings of Jesus Christ. It's been a long, long road from there to here. You can trace it all the way back to about the 4th century, really. The first time that I have been able to find any reference to someone picking up an exposed infant for any reason other than slavery. St. Augustine told that now children who are abandoned are often picked up by Christian families so they can be brought into church, so they can be raised in the knowledge of Christ, so they can have a home. Never saw that, not before Jesus Christ. So when I look at something that's been growing to our benefit, the benefit of the least of these in our society, it's been growing for that long, 2,000 years, I ask myself, okay, if that was normal for so long, then it must require a great effort to keep those things at bay. How are we doing in this day and age? By and large, I think we're doing okay. At least we're doing better than 3,500 years ago in Gezer in Canaan. But there's also enough warning signs that we have got to take them. You all know this just as well as I do, but I'm going to run through some of these warning signs real quick because I believe it's important. In ancient Rome, for example, abortion was popular and it was dangerous. Nowadays, it's less dangerous. It's more popular. And I wonder why it is so popular. So I ran across a study that was done by our government that is paid for with our tax dollars, including mine. Somebody, we pay for a lot of people to get abortions every year. How's that going for us? And why do people choose to have abortions? So we're not talking about medical emergencies here. We're talking about a poll of young women who went out wanting to get an abortion because they have what this report refers to as an aspirational one-year plan. In other words, where do you see yourself in 1 year? And would it be easier for you to do that if you didn't have a kid? And some of the responses on that poll, what are your 1 year goals? What are your 1 year aspirations? And how's that working out for you? And some of the responses that were given to this particular study, and I'm just going to read what some of these young women wrote down. I hope that I'll be back in school. That's probably pretty common. I just want to be happy. Another one wrote, less stressful. One respondent wrote, I hope to take better care of myself. One respondent wrote, have my own car for what it's worth. This is our government. A member of our government, 1 month ago, a member of our government was talking to a reporter and said, we need more immigrants because we just don't have enough children being born in America today. Another government study was done to try and find out why kids are so unhappy. Well, why are kids so unhappy? Well, they have to go to school. That made me plenty unhappy. And so that's where this particular study took place, in school. And found that a lot of students are contemplating or attempting suicide in 2021. More than half of our young girls are sad or hopeless, not just, on Thursday, but every day for weeks on end. And in fact, the largest group of sad, hopeless, despondent teenagers are those in the LGBT lifestyle. And that lifestyle is being promoted and celebrated and, I would say in some ways, pushed. It's not resulting in greater happiness. I can tell you why I think that is, but at this point, results ought to be speaking for themselves. You know that less than a year ago, Canada legalized euthanasia? You guys read about that? Some people, like myself, for example, said, oh, it's a slippery slope. Watch. No, it's not a slippery slope. Well, in the Canadian government, there are committees discussing whether they need to extend euthanasia to children without age limit, without parental consent if necessary. Hasn't been passed into law yet, but the government's looking at it, they're studying the issue, they're asking the question. See, sometimes when you say you're worried about a slippery slope, all you're really saying is that you understand the lessons of history. So why do I say that we need to fight for our children? It's because Satan hates our children. He wants to consume them. In fact, that's the picture of Satan in Revelation chapter 12. The virgin was about to give birth, and the dragon crouched, waiting for her to give birth, so he could consume her infant. And this is why we're fighting for our children, because there really is a battle going on. The real enemy and the children are the prize. And I use that word because that's exactly how Jesus viewed children, as a prize of infinite value, worth fighting for. There are people being used by our enemy to spread lies and set snares to confuse and decimate our kids. And it's happening a lot more in our culture than I wish it was. And I'm convinced that most of them don't realize the seriousness of the conflict, don't realize where we have been and where I suppose we could end up again one day. If people aren't fighting for our children. Because the truth is often hidden. Like this, this is an archaeological dig, but what does it look like now? Well, now it's cleaned up and it's been whitewashed and it's carefully sort of manicured, and it's a tourist attraction. You can take a day hike to this spot in Geezer. People pack picnics. They eat lunch there. And on any given day, you might find children crawling on that altar again, playing curious, totally unaware of what happened there one day. It strikes fear in my heart. So many people have no idea how easily human life can be ravaged by sin. And I thank God that the restraining spirit is still here and has not been removed from us yet. We need to do our part. But you know what? This isn't where we started this morning. We actually started with the story of Hagar. I hope you remember that, because it's been kind of a rough 27 minutes, and I acknowledge that. But the story of Hagar is where I want to end, because she couldn't bear to see what was happening to her child. And you know what? I'm willing to bet that there's a lot of people here today who can acknowledge that feeling. Why do we have to think about this stuff? Why do we have to know about this? Why do we have to have such unpleasant realities brought to our attention? Besides, what can we do? What can we do? What should we do? It's a lot easier just to avert our eyes. But you know who doesn't avert his eyes? God. Remember what Hagar called him, the God who sees? Here's how the story ends. Hagar walks off a couple dozen yards, and she meets God again. And he showed her a well that she didn't even know was there. And he sent her back with a promise. He's not going to die. He's going to survive. And you get to raise him. She went back to him with water. He did revive. He did survive. His life was saved. And I believe that God is still watching every life that is ever conceived, watching every child that is ever born. His eyes are on us here at Bethel Church, on us and our families, on the children that we bring to our Wednesday night programs, the kids in our Sunday school, our youth group. He has given us a shield of faith. And let me tell you something, there's enough room under that shield for the children who depend on us until their own faith is strong enough and mature enough to decide for themselves to follow Jesus Christ. And that calling is probably the most important thing that we can do. That's why I've said it before, and I will say it again. It's possible the most important thing happening this morning is taking place in the FLC. But you and I, we're not going to just shake our heads at the madness of the modern world and just shrug our shoulders and feel hopeless while children are victimized by the enemy. We're not going to do that. In Lamentations chapter 1, we are told, pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children. That's what we're going to do this morning. Our morning services usually end right at 1:45, which gives us about 6 minutes. And here's what I would like to do for the last 6 minutes of this morning service. We haven't done this since I've been here, but we're going to do it this morning. I'm going to ask everyone here to bunch up with someone else. Form groups of 3 to 5 people, something like that. Turn around, there's people behind you, maybe you can form up with people sitting next to you. Tracy's going to play some music, so we're going to keep it kind of soft, and I want us to pray together in these small groups. You may want to pray for your grandchildren or for your kids. You may want to pray for children in the FLC right now. In your bulletin, there is a piece of paper with the names of the children in our youth group. Pray for them. Take this home and pray for them. Hold them up. Intercede for them before the throne of our Heavenly Father. And we will see who's really hopeless and helpless in the fight for the lives and the souls of our children. I'm going to give you now some time to gather together. I'm going to ask you to pray as small groups.